So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Platonic dialogue Parmenides. Now it so happens that my stomach is quite communicative today, so hopefully it's not picked up too readily by the microphone, but I think it will. So my apologies for that. So I've stopped giving introductions to these episodes because we've been to so many different places. They are exercises that are completed day in and day out, and they certainly require context, but what we've built so far, given the amount of time that we've spent, it would be too difficult, I think, to describe exactly everything that we've gone through. Some of it wouldn't be relevant. I think most of it comes out as we move into the episode. Each one is about 2 hours, so it'll unfold in time, and the context will slowly reveal itself, and it'll make more sense as time goes on. But as an explicit introduction, I'm not going to give a comprehensive one. So before we ended last episode, we finished on a short paragraph that in which Parmenides says, "And yet, since it is in itself, it would also be around itself, on the outside, and as container it would be greater than itself, but as contained it would be less, and thus the one would be greater and less than itself." Yes, it would be, says Aristotle. So there's an important point as we get into this to remember that there is this sort of graduated, layered perspectival but also phenomenological expression of identity. And it can be quite confusing to figure out where we are given a certain language and all the rest. So just as Parmenides said here, how could it be possible that something is within itself, and by that situation it is smaller than itself, and being outside of itself it's then larger than itself? These concepts are foreign to somebody that just approaches it off the street, so to speak. And while they may, in some sense, be inaccurate to say it in this way, there's another structural way in which it is consistent. Now, we've been speaking on this concept of the light cone. The light cone is, we could just take it as an identity, as something that, much like a lamp that shines in the dark, it has its specific circumference that outlines the penetration of light. That penetration I've been describing as the expression of the identity in question. When we move into complex systems, the simple images that are used, like the light cone, for example, becomes quite complex, and it can be quite difficult to navigate. And I think that we are sort of on the cusp of leaving this sort of structural, more simple, principled place into something that is quite complex and quite difficult. So beginning with the next paragraph, Parmenides says, "Isn't this necessary, too, that there be nothing outside the one and the others?" No doubt, says Aristotle. But surely What is must always be somewhere. What is must always be somewhere. So let's think about this first sentence. Isn't it necessary, too, that there be nothing outside the one and the others? Now, why is this the case? And how are we to conceptualize something being outside of the one? On one hand, we're used to using this language to describe the one as an identity that's sort of independent of the effect of the one, let's say. And why is that important? Because the effect of the one, it's almost like my relations and how my behavior in my relationships affects people and how it transmits through their life. The effect can be there without sort of my identity being completely present in every situation. In a more fundamental sense, we have the situation in which the one, which is the coherence between oneness and being, expresses itself in such a way that forms the field by which other things can not only come to be, but cohere into something that is one. And together, by these principles, we have the abundance of things and the layering of difference and of determinations and descriptions that give us all that we see around us. We've been using the language of the determinate landscape, a place where we speak of principles. We speak of things that are not descriptive. They don't have properties like we're used to. There's none of this color. There's none of the hardness, roundness. There's none of this. In the determinate landscape, we have this and that. We have inside, outside. We have center and periphery. Many of these basic, both relational and positional terms. And while we ventured out into the periphery and we've discussed interrelatedness there as it applies, we are still sort of slowly building ourselves away from the beginning place, which I'm calling as the one, the expression of the one. So on one hand, we can think about saying the outside of the one as outside of the identity of the one. The identity of the one that is something that is quite understood and known. Again, we have two parts to it. It is the oneness and being, and this phenomena that I've been calling the bridge of coherence, which is the thing that unites them and leads to the expression of it, that creates the field. Now, if we are to say what is outside of the field, the expression of oneness and being, that's a different question. It's a more difficult question. I'm not really sure that it's a question that needs an answer. Why is that the case? What is outside of the field? In some sense, we could say that nothing is outside of the field. But nothing is still an identity, which is kind of bizarre. Because we are saying that thing is not. Nothing as a concept is useful only within certain bounds. It exists within the field. Existence itself must be, in a way, the language I think breaks down a bit, because there is no inside-outside dynamic when it comes to the field. If it is produced of the field. Isn't this necessary, too, that there be nothing outside the one and the others? Now, as a placeholder, I think we could just say that there's nothing outside of it. But thinking about it more critically, if I have to take a second pass at this, a second pass at outside the one in terms of its expression, we would be asking effectively, what is the question outside of being and oneness? And we could say nothing as a placeholder, but again, I find that there's an issue with that. Nothingness, or no thing, even itself, describes something. It describes a lacking of something. It's still a boundary. It's still an identity. It exists within a context of lacking, let's say. It's not descriptive, of course, because there's no thing. True absence, this sort of void. In the mind, it's easy to imagine this sort of darkness, for which there truly is this absence of being. But of course, even darkness is something. And true absence is a bizarre term. And it doesn't really make any sense. Only if it was within the field of things, or within the field of being and oneness. Does it then seem to make sense? Because then it's coherent, at least. Now the second line, but surely what is must always be somewhere. Now this idea of somewhere, I think that there's a broader implication there, because we could say that somewhere is restricted to some spatial orientation, but I don't think that that's the whole of it. By somewhere, I have to imagine a broader sense of place, where it's not just a matter of if I stood up and walked across this room to the other side of it, that I'd be in a different place, but rather that I could think in one context and then think in another, and still have this sort of spatial image in mind of where my thoughts have gone and where my awareness of certain concepts is. And even of the identity landscape itself, as we think about the determinate field built on top of the field of the expression of the one. That within this place, it's not like I can point anywhere in the universe to it. The one, I could point anywhere, really, and we could find it. not the pure identity of it, but we can find things that participate with those principles. Then won't that which is in something be in something greater as something less, says Parmenides. Then won't that which is in something be in something greater as something less. So here we find ourselves thinking both about an essential impossibility of having something outside of the field of the one, but then also thinking about this interlacing sort of Russian doll situation. What I've been calling graduated, I'm not sure if that's the best term. Fractal is another term that is widely used to describe not only just how the one, the expression of the one, can be found in things lesser and greater again being a determinate term that we mentioned, but also in terms of identity itself, how this can be something that can interweave. Then won't that which is in something be in something greater as something less? And so there's another layer by which we can conceptualize this. We're saying, well, what happens at the bedrock? For if there are all of these layers by which we can sort of go deeper and figure out another outside of something, why can't we do this for our base principle of the one? And I think the answer is fairly straightforward. It's because this field is the soil, the conditions by which things come to be. Parmenides says, "For there is no other way that something could be in something else." No, there isn't, says Aristotle, since there is nothing else apart from the others and the one, and since they must be in something, must they not in fact be in each other? The others in the one, and the one in the others, or else be nowhere. Apparently, says Aristotle. Now here I think we're really starting to get to the heart of the exploration of what is meant by this interweaving. For when we say the one and we say the others, that the others are inside of the one and the one is inside of the others, we are at the very least recognizing the strong relationship between the two. And that if the one is going to be this expression of oneness and being, that is sort of at the bedrock, the foundation by which we understand identity formation to begin. And as we move into this identity landscape, and we have sort of otherness that is away from the initial expression, it's undoubtable that we are going to be able to feel and see the effects of this expression in all things. And by this sort of symbiosis, we flip it around and we say, from the multiplicity of things that are, we can see how they participate in a shared framework. They are sort of born into the field, that substrate, and blossom as unique identities. Now, I think that thinking about the inside and outside dynamic affords us with another potential avenue. This other potential avenue I have to think about an avenue of connection. The word relation or relatedness is, I don't want to overuse the term without being too specific, because then it hollows it. It doesn't retain its meaning very well. But if we think about connection, and then we think about significance, perhaps we think about purpose, this layering of the inside and the outside, of something that is within something being smaller than something that is smaller than the thing that it is in, the thing that it is in being larger, and then perhaps the thing that it is in, that thing itself is also within something. It doesn't have to be a very basic sketch or diagram. It could be quite sophisticated in the way that it relates in this manner. For we do have an image of the identity landscape that is a bit gray in certain areas. There's overlap, there's perhaps redundancy in which qualities are shared, in which we have the formation of this class of the kind. We have shared properties, of course. Many things share properties. That much is obvious. But again, as a matter of connection, we find that although there may be things that are separated by the big and the small, I think it is the case that there is something continuous that unites the inside and the outside, the center and the periphery. The center and the periphery is more of an obvious example. So I'm going to just speak and sort of move into the hypothetical landscape, and then I'll try to bring this back around. Parmenides says, just reading over again where we've been, isn't this necessary too, that there be nothing outside the one and the others? No doubt. But surely what is must always be somewhere. Yes. Then won't that which is in something be in something greater as something less? For there is no other way that something could be in something else. No, there isn't, says Aristotle. Since there is nothing else apart from the others and the one, and since they must be in something, must they not in fact be in each other, the others in the one, and the one in the others, or else be nowhere? Apparently, says Aristotle. So we're pointing to an inherent relationship between otherness and the one, that it's not a separate situation. And I think we've established the field is a nice analogy or image by which we can establish this image while maintaining the separate identity of the one versus its expression or its influence. So on the one hand, says Parmenides, because the one is in the others would be greater than the one, since they contain it. and the one would be less than the others, since it is contained. On the other hand, because the others are in the one, by the same argument, the one would be greater than the others, and they would be less than it. So I think we have to pause here and think about our determinate landscape, and what exactly does this mean? What does it mean for us to have this interweaving, overlapping, determinate features? Now, one thing that comes to mind is that when we have this sort of primordial pre-quality identity, that is, just determinate features and not descriptive features. So I want to go through sort of a master list of these determinate features, so we can have a place of reference. It's not exhaustive, but it'll serve us a strong foundation. So we have same, we have otherness or different, we have this and that, we have one and many, we have inside, outside, we have center, periphery, we have part, whole, before, after, here, there, near, far, like, unlike, equal, unequal, greater, lesser, more, fewer, larger, smaller, earlier, later, prior, posterior, above, below, left, right, bounded, unbounded, limit, unlimited. And we've sorted these in terms of structural determinations. These are on top of the one, so they use the expression of oneness in being to generate the field of identity. They don't require measurement or comparison. They establish orientation, distinction, and boundary. So, for example, same, other, or same and different, this and that, one and many, inside, outside, center, periphery, etc. So they carve an intelligible space. They might answer where something is, what's distinct from something else, what belongs within what. And then we have our relational determinations. And these depend on the relationship between identities. They describe how they relate. So here we have like and unlike, same in relation or other in relation, near or far, before, after. So they answer, how are the things related? How are they aligned or opposed? Do they resemble or differ? And then we have comparative determinations, which I think is a step beyond where we were with our relational determinations, and I've been guilty of using relational determinations and comparative determinations sort of side by side, but I think we have to separate them. So in these, the comparative determinations, we have a measurement or gradation between the identities. They can't exist without a comparison of degree. So here we have greater or lesser, more or fewer, larger, smaller, equal, unequal, earlier, later. And what's interesting is we've moved to this place of the inside and the outside, and of the larger and the smaller, in the graduated sense. And so there's a way in which we can think of it sort of off of the tap, off of the source, off of the field of the one. And then there's a way that we can think about it in terms of the complexity. Where we have greater and greater difference and greater and greater multitude of identities that are participating on this fundamental field. Now, in terms of the terms that measure relations, they answer how much, to what degree, and in what proportion. So in summary of all of this, our structural terms are where and what boundary. Our relational is how are they connected. Our comparative is how much or to what degree. And these are all determinate terms. These are before qualities. Okay, so getting back to Parmenides, getting back to what we were initially going to explore, we have a sort of complexity theory that's emerging. And my mind is torn between thinking about only the determinate layer, to keep it simple, as we expand through the terms, and then moving into the landscape of qualities, which adds to the uniqueness of identities. And as we do that, there's going to be a lot of overlap. Determinate terms don't cease. They, almost like with every quality that emerges, we have a set value of relationships. And I wouldn't get too caught up in the word set. What I mean by set is sort of the snapshot of the identity or the character in question. Okay, so I think I know where we should continue this discussion. In order to avoid confusion and getting lost in an abundance of information that's not consolidated very well, I think we should leave the descriptive landscape, because although we've been in the determinate landscape for a long time, we're making progress there, and we're building it out, and we're approaching the descriptive layer. And I wouldn't want to jump back and forth between the descriptive layer when we don't really understand how it translates from the determinate to the descript, and how characters form, what characters are, what characteristics are, I should say. Now, we have stable definitions for these terms, for qualities, for character and identity and all of that sort of thing. But still, I think there needs to be more patience before we get there. So we have these structural, these comparative, and these relational terms. Where we are, I think, is a moment in determinate space that it gives me a little bit of anxiety, because I'm not sure if it's because of complexity or the possibility therein. Probably the possibility, because the anxiety emerges when there's so many things, so much information, potential information, so many avenues to go down and examples to explore, that it's almost impossible to choose one. So we're wrestling with the layers, even within the determinate sphere. We're wrestling with the layers because we can have this inside and outside dynamic within the determinate landscape. And we can have greater and smaller within the determinate landscape. And the complexity of this geometry, I think, can exist independent of moving into an area in which qualities are becoming more and more important. Because if I were to suddenly say something like courage, bravery, trustworthiness as characteristics or character traits, this would be quite difficult, I think, to square firmly with our determinate language. We can get there, and we will get there, but it's a bit of a leap. They're very complex terms. So I sort of want to go back and touch on sort of the first part of the paragraph again. Let's go over it again, because I feel like we just didn't get the image described quite right, or go through the exercise enough to where it's having a positive effect on our understanding. So again, Parmenides, he says, "Isn't this necessary too, that there be nothing outside the one and the others?" So our initial conversation about this had to do with the difficulty with understanding nothing outside of being, essentially. If it's outside of the one or otherness, whatever. And I came to this conclusion that I'm still a bit uncertain about, and that's that nothing is a sort of a requisite term, in the sense that there's requirements that nothing can be something to be discussed. There's the conceptual nothing, and we've struggled with this in the Sophist, but there's the conceptual nothing in the sense that this type of nothing indicates an absence of being. And then there's the sort of the philosophical nothing, if we can describe it in this way. And the philosophical nothing is a concept that only can exist because of being itself. That the concept of nothing is being. It has an identity of itself. It means something. But it's almost like a placeholder for which we're describing a hypothetical, some sort of imaginary situation that just cannot be. And that the nothingness, this is the third layer, the nothingness that we experience in our day-to-day, let's say, is again more of a relational structure. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, I can ask the question, or I can be asked the question, what is in front of you? And I would say that nothing is in front of me. But of course, it's not really the case that nothing is in front of me. It's not sort of an absence of being such that, well, I have to be careful here. In some sense, there's an absence of being. Now, in the material sense, there is stuff there, even though I can't see it. So that's one layer. There's another layer, a deeper layer, perhaps the philosophical layer, in which, when I say that there's nothing in front of me, it would describe the field of potential for which oneness in being has no effect. The coherence of that has no place. And so what does that mean? It would mean that it would be impossible for being to exist in front of me, while also saying that nothing is in front of me. But of course, it's not the case that that absence, or that being is impossible to be in front of me, because I could put something in front of me and then there's something is there. But that is only possible because of the underlying field of the expression of the one, of the coherence between oneness and being. So I think that's a more satisfactory way of going about understanding this nothingness. Now, when Parmenides says nothing outside of the one and the other, or otherness, I think he's referring to sort of the definitional hypothetical term of absence. But it's impossible to think about this if we're not thinking about sort of all of these layers together. And perhaps he said this on purpose to have us consider and to think about it. That's hard to say, really. Or at least the exercise that he's going through is prompting us to consider it. So it's effectively the same thing. Isn't this necessary too, that there be nothing outside the one and the others? But surely, what is must always be somewhere. Now, the same situation occurs here as we had in the case of nothing. Somewhere is sort of this spatial representation. Not everything that not every being that we come into contact with or participate with or can recognize or realize is spatial. There are plenty of non-spatial beings. A thought can, I think, be a potential non-spatial being. Now, it's occurring in the mind, and it's a result of a material process, but pointing to it is impossible. And this is where we might get into some dilemmas when we talk about reducibility, materiality, and then being outside of that. We've already been talking for many hours about the determinate landscape, this sort of secondary field that is on top of the one. It's a philosophical one, but it's something that is not necessarily spatial in the material sense. There's a spatial reality in terminology, but this is not something that if we were to outright develop our spatial terms, that we would be able to point to it in some physical space. Of course, we wouldn't be able to do that. Spatial, much like nothing as a placeholder, it sort of serves the same purpose. But surely what is must always be somewhere. Okay, so to describe this farther, what does he mean by must be somewhere? I think there's a broader sense. If we take a similar reasoning as we applied to nothingness, that true nothing is absence in a sense, but absence is unstable because it cannot be, and so it's a hypothetical. Nothing is truly absent in a reality that involves the coherence of oneness and being. So when we take the spatial representation, we have to understand that space is not reducible to the material. And that it includes sort of a relational context, a relational meaning. So let's say space at the outset. When we use space, we use it as a term to identify a place for something that is. And in the human context, our material world is what we live through. It's the information that we take in. It's what we synthesize and what we understand about reality. And so all of this spatial talk is represented in this way. There are plenty of things around me. I'm living in a place. I'm sitting on a chair. I'm making contact with material objects. I have this cat that's sitting in my lap. There are plenty of things by which I'm orienting myself in my environment spatially. Space is another term that is something, obviously. It requires the field. It requires the field of the one in order for it to be. And we can't say that the field itself is somewhere because in some sense it's everywhere. It is where it is not. It is where, rather, material is not, because it's this field of potential and probability. It's the building blocks of reality that we find ourselves in, that coherence is possible, that it's not just sort of this absent void. So somewhere, I think I find myself beginning to understand that the important part about space is not that I can touch it or that I can place it on a map in sort of a physical map, let's say, but rather the map is broadened to include the field of being and non-being. This is more the sophist interpretation, the dialogue of the sophist, not a sophist's interpretation. That being and non-being participate in this sort of dynamic, interwoven process. And that the map, in this sense, in the broad spatial sense, is principled as much as it is material. Because it leaves room for understanding. And I think that eventually we're going to have to get into that more, because this gets into motion, direction, purpose, all that sort of thing. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So I'm thinking of how to continue where we left off yesterday. A thought occurred to me that as we're recognizing what it means potentially to go past these boundaries, in fact what we are doing is establishing the boundaries themselves, I think. Now, what does that mean? Well, we've thought about the hypotheticals in which there are ways in which seeing that which is beyond being is untenable. The very grammar, the language, the architecture by which we use to conceptualize it is grounded within this sort of being landscape. And for sort of this absence to just be doesn't make any sense. It's a contradiction. So even the thoughts of it are contradictions unless it is layered within the context of being, such that something that is absent or not existent can exist, but only within the context of being. A strange irony. And then we go a little bit farther and we expand our ideas not just of inside and outside, but also of space itself. And in order to do that, we expanded away from the self's conception or the self's participation in primarily material things. And I think that there's an extended version of this where we would say that there is a modern conception in which we say that we see things naturalistically, scientifically to a degree. And because of this, we think very materially. And although our thoughts and our purposes, our desires these are immaterial, we sort of take them for granted. And again, this is more of a modern cultural distinction. But anyway, this was brought up, I think, primarily to get us to see an expansive view of space, and not just something that is entirely restricted to an ontology, a sort of a dynamic and changing human ontology, let's say, through the subjective experience, through the limitations that are afforded by the sensors that we naturally possess in the body to pick up on information in the environment. So the next sentence of Parmenides, I think the first two sentences here that we just addressed were the primary issues that I had, because I did not feel comfortable moving on. But I want to continue with this exercise and go through this as a second pass, as was said earlier. So we move on, and Parmenides says, "Then won't that which is in something be in something greater as something less?" And here, I think the image of the weaver is important. What is interwoven is various contexts, various determinate features, and various information points on the properties of these things, and then the the more here and now type components or words that we would use to describe things. So I think where we are at is the point at which the very base, and I think we've been here before, and I sort of got scared of where we were because there was a bit of too much complexity, but we're sort of at the base of the determinate sphere and moving into the sphere of the qualities and of the characteristics. But we have to keep in mind the levels and the layers of this. The first pass away from the one, sort of Genesis-esque 7 days of creation, moving out away from God's presence hovering over the chaotic information, or perhaps just the chaotic potential that is being, and then ordering, producing by some dynamic process. The way in which this process unfolds, of course, is something that many people have devoted their lives to studying, but this is not something that we need to be particularly hung up now, as the specifics will only hold us back in a certain respect. There's a place and time for it. Right now, it's not the time for it. So again, then won't that which is in something be in something greater as something less? For there is no other way that something could be in something else. Since there is nothing else apart from the others and the one, and since they must be in something, must they not in fact be in each other? So a perfect image of this sort of interlacing, interwoven experience of the expression of the one, the relationships of our determinate terms, and then the evolution into more complex identities. And then the overlapping of information between identities. But the stability, I think, is something that is interesting. So let's speak on our determinate features again briefly. And I want to pull up my notes on our list of terms. And we're not going to go through all of them, of course, but just a few that would give us some sort of indication, and then maybe work on some complexity hypothetical. So already in this paragraph, we're dealing with the one and many. So the oneness in the sense of the identity of the one, but the expression is oneness in being, and then the many, or that which he says as the other, which is also an expression of the one, but it is not the identity of the one. It is sort of a multiple of ones, let's say. It's the unification of oneness and being, but circled in this sort of bracket of other and of many. And I think this is one of the first distinctions that we can make beside the first identity, so to speak, which is the one. The second identity would be the many, or the outside, or the others. And then when we speak about that landscape, it's not a competition between the one and the others. It's not as though the one must contain otherness in order for the one to participate with these things. We have the one as an identity existing on top of its own expression, which is interesting. Oneness and being must sort of have a functional relationship in order to even express, in order to even conceptualize its identity, let's say. It's sort of at the moment of its conception, than it is, so to speak. So from there, as I've said, it's not really a matter of thinking about the one as separate from others. It's otherness participating on top of a shared unification of two principles. And we can go and we can look into the one and we could say, well, this is our first stable identity. It has a sort of a name. It's not as indeterminate as otherness, or that boundary around whatever the others are. There are specific principles within this thing. We've already gone through sort of a structural view of what the one looks like. I've put forth this idea of the conceptual bridge of coherence, and this gives us a center, whereas the peripheries or the poles are oneness and being. The center is that connection by which the expression facilitates the many, facilitates all. Even within the one, we see principles of many and one, or part and of whole. If we move into otherness, which is a less explored topic, we have things that are not as distinct as the one as an identity, because we don't really know what they are yet. But the fact that they are other is something that gives it an identity. It's stable in its otherness. So the question is, well, when it is other, is it stable enough such that anything that comes to be must be sort of attributed to it? I think there's a farther clarifying question there. Another question is how. How is it possible that we can begin from a place where we have something that is so nondescript, but yet determinate as something just saying other than the one, and then find ourselves into a landscape that is highly descriptive and highly particular and highly I'm blanking on the term. Highly expressive in a particular moment that the information, the light cones that are surrounded are so fine-tuned, let's say, as to maintain it given very narrow parameters and have things shift from one place to another, transform themselves from one identity to another, or rather I should say the self is then morphed. The self is not moving from one identity to another, so to speak. The self is ceasing to be in a particular way. It's moving outside of the center of its identity and then decoupling into separate unities that become themselves the center point of attention, the selves, let's say, and then maybe reunifying somewhere else into something that is equally particular. And this happens on billions of times at these billions of different scales and layers. But still the question remains. So I've asked two. The third question would be, how is it the case that, or rather I should say, is it the fact that the best way to approach thinking about identity formation is at the determinate layer? The whole project of breaking things down to their simplest components affords us a lot of insight about what something is. But if I broke myself down into my simplest components, if I did it materially, I would miss something. If I did it spiritually, I would miss something. If I did it, I guess those would be the two main ones, but maybe other terms that we can use, but those are pretty encompassing. I would miss something because I would have a bunch of parts, and I would lack that bridge of coherence between the parts. So it's almost like a separate bridge of coherence. Whereas we have the one, which the fundamental principles are oneness and being, but when we have one identity and then the bridge coheres the other identity to get together, that's another type of bridge of coherence and of expression of that thing, of that relationship. And so it is within these that are coming together. So within the field, there seems to be almost an infinite number of possibilities. We really haven't discussed agency here. The question of how things come to be seems to collide with the question of, is it the natural starting place for identity to begin at this field and then have our first identity being the one and then otherness separate from it? Is that the most productive way to think about it? The question arises because we run into a wall of, well, how do additional things just sort of come to be? How do they congregate? How does complexity emerge? So in order to answer some of these questions, I think we have to go a little bit more, we have to take shorter steps. Okay, so we're taking shorter steps. What does this mean? It's undeniable that we have to start with something to facilitate the relationship of oneness and being, right? So we have to have this field that begins, the substrate through which we plant the seed. Then the seed grows. What is the seed growing into? It's growing into potential. It's grabbing onto something, the sort of dark matter. What is this dark matter? I've been calling it potential. In my mind, I think of this sort of Velcro-like structure but if I were to reach my hand to it, it would be something particular to my skin, such that my hand can grasp it, it can adhere to it. It's like a scaffolding by which I'm moving on, that every time that I grab onto it, I'm pulling away information that I can use myself and I can create with it. But the information itself, when I take it when I reach into this abstraction and I grab it and I bring it to myself, is sort of this dark, moving substance. It's a bit crunchy, maybe it's a bit static in its sound. It's nondescript. Like I've said, it's this sort of determinate landscape. What do I make of it? I can't make much of it, really. Until, perhaps, I recognize that I've taken off too large of a piece, and that of this weird, dark, fluid-like, static, crunchy thing that I have, I take off a little piece of it. And then I say a little prayer. What comes to mind is intention and purpose. And all of a sudden, this thing that seems like it's foreign, that I can't have any use for it, all of a sudden becomes relevant in the context through which I'm trying to move, let's say. I'm trying to progress. And when I see that this thing, when I take a small piece of it away and I give it contextual boundaries, maybe I give it a question, I give it a problem, I place this thing in there and I realize that what I have done is I have given a problem or a movement a track to move on, much like this thing that I'm doing. Where's the track? I'm just speaking into a microphone. I haven't read a sentence for 5-10 minutes. What's happening? I'm putting things together, but what things together? Well, there's information from this dialogue, but a lot of this is coming from somewhere. I'm not saying that it's a mysterious place. Perhaps there's mysterious things about it until it's understood in a little bit greater detail. But I'm saying that what I'm walking on is this sort of scaffolding of being. And while boundaries exists everywhere, it's a part of this determinate experience. It's a very small, well, it's a large part, but also a small part, as Parmenides is pointing out here. There is this layering, this contextual layering that is taking place. And what I'm grabbing onto is nothing. I'm going through a process, this sort of self-dialectic of shaping and trying to understand what I should be using the information of experience and motion to produce. So on the one hand, says Parmenides, because the one is in the others would be greater than the one, since they contain it. And the one would be less than the others, since it is contained. So at this place, I find it interesting because it's sort of an assist in terms of understanding how another term can find itself, another determinate term can find itself within this primordial phase. And I say primordial because it's pre everything that I understand to be. Now, why is this useful? In thinking, because the one is in the others would be greater than the one, since they contain it. And since the one would be less than the others, since it is contained. What we have here almost seems like a linchpin or the end on a knot or something that ties sort of a space together, so to speak. It's the glue, it's the scaffolding, it's the order. Because it affords the greater and lesser. It affords the inside and the outside. And there's a back and forth, because the others are in the one. By the same argument, the one would be greater than the others, and they less than it. So among themselves, I think we must also see a similar comparison, but it's a step away from, it's a movement in a different direction. So what does that mean? When we dive into otherness in this determinate field, what we see is a bunch of independent points. Let's call them identity, points of identity, light cones. They are bounded by this otherness. Within themselves, we find the one. Within the one, we find these things. So in each one of these now, we have a different landscape that has emerged. It's not just this large field by which this rough potential exists, by which that former analogy works well, where it's not nothing, it's just potential. But then the identity, the first identity appears, it's the coherence between oneness and being, and then we have this boundary of otherness. Within the boundary of otherness, we have points, we have singularity, we have oneness and being. The light, it turns on. Well, what is this light? What is it illuminating? At the first instance, what we have is just multiple points of something that we can identify. Then we focus on it, almost like we see when we look into the distance and we see something that is not focused in our vision. So we don't maybe understand even what the thing is. We just understand that it is something behind this sort of foggy mist. And then we move towards it, or we focus on it in greater detail. And then features begin to take place. But in this context, what we see is we see a greater than and a less than. We see, to go back to our determinate terms here, we do have a this and that. We're inside of the many, so to speak. We might have an inside and outside within the many. And so we have a repeating pattern then that would occur. So we have the one identity that partakes in the one, but what is this one? But it's separate from other things that are many. We can have a part of a whole. These light cones, again, are nondescript, but they are light cones that are participating in something. We have here than there, we have something that is farther in the otherness landscape, we have something that is closer. We have a greater concentration and a lesser concentration. We have things that have firm limits and things that have more fluid boundaries, let's say, participate in more than one thing. we have things that are like something else. And because they are like, they are somewhat similar, or they are similar. We have things perhaps that are recognized or have come into being sooner or earlier, some perhaps later. This still doesn't quite solve our descriptive situation, as we still haven't gotten to that point where descriptions obviously enter our equation. Parmenides says, therefore, the one is both equal to and greater and less than itself and the others. And so we move from here to the next paragraph. And Parmenides says, and if in fact it is greater and less and equal, it would be of measures equal to and more and fewer than itself and the others, and since of measures, also of parts. So let's spend some time considering the implications of this. We've had this ongoing or running idea that this hasn't been an inherent contradiction, that something can be greater, less, and equal to itself at the same time because of the way that it is expressed. And the fact that it is expressed among multiple layers. Now, the important part that we have yet to go through is this term measures. It would be of equal measures. It would be of measures equal to and more and fewer than itself and the others. Now, by what measure would we say that this is the case? Now, we can go to the initial proposition that because of the expression and the existence at the multiple levels, that is, the one and its expression is found in multiplicity or in otherness because of its necessity to centralize and cohere identity. Even if it changes from one level to another, we can still identify the shift and the change from one place to another. And the scales exist at the very small, and the scales exist at the very large. Now, on one hand, we can say that measure is part of our determinate landscape. It is the determination of a thing by reference to a standard, limit, or proportion, such that its extent, degree, or relation can be made intelligible. So we have to think then, by what standard is measure related? I have to think to a degree we're thinking about our terms, our determinate terms. And it's not just a quantifying of these terms, as measure so often is reduced to. But there does need to be some standard by which we can say that it is a measure. And so far, I suppose we've been using language to measure these things. We've been using our determinate terms, greater than, less than, inside, outside, center, periphery. And so again, and if in fact it is greater and less and equal, it would be of measures equal to and more and fewer than itself and the others. So in some sense, it's not really saying all that much that's new. Outside of introducing this word, measure, we're still exposed to the same idea of this stratification and of existence at multiple levels. And I think that it's important when we talk about measure, if we are going to say that the one is less than itself, we say, okay, then where is our reference point? Are we saying that the expression of the one is found within an electron, and the expression of the one is found also in hydrogen, or in lead, let's say? And in these cases, we could say that the electron is smaller than the atom of lead. So my apologies, but today is a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So today happens to be a Friday evening, and I found it difficult, not just of late, but in general. Friday evenings are always difficult to exercise the mind. The day is over, the week is over, and it seems that there has been so much mental energy roused and exercised throughout the week that it's a bit fatiguing by the end. But it's within these moments that I have to reflect and think about the greater purpose and drive of life and behind the things that we do. And as much as I wish not to admit it at times, at other times I'm all about it, that this sort of active disposition is really what we need. And that even for those of us that are what they consider to be type B or reserved, it is not such that we are reserved because the mind is absent or wishes to dissociate from productive things. And also I think that there is an important distinction to be made between this and what they call a hustle culture. It's a common cultural expression which has to do with making these gains, these productive gains, but under superficial standards. So maybe it's a pay raise, which may not be superficial in and of itself, but the standard by which the raise is achieved may be superficial. It may involve participation in some sort of structure that at multiple levels at the individual or communal layer really doesn't bring the society very much benefit other than the self's increase, the self's benefit and enjoyment. And so we keep these in mind, and we say that our productive expenditures are for meaningful purposes. And if we don't understand the meaning at the outset, it's our responsibility, it's my responsibility to press forward and to find it within the text or within whatever pursuit it happens to be. So with that, let's get back into the dialogue. So I tried a little bit of recording this morning, and I remember I was making a point about what's on the periphery of an atom with relation to its electrons and the atom as a whole, and that we can see the principle of the one within the parts of things as much as we can see the principle of the one in the whole of the thing itself. So I'll read this one more time, the beginning sentence. And if in fact it is greater and less and equal, it would be of measures equal to and more and fewer than itself and the others, and since of measures, also of parts. So this intrigued me a bit, because our definition from earlier, I can't remember what I said exactly, but it's something about a determinate way in which we can sort of have something adhere to a standard by which it becomes intelligible in our mind. And this standard sets limits on the extents of things. It defines the determinate features. And this is something that we've been talking about ad nauseum, going over it over and over and over again, sometimes more successful than others. Now, what I want to reflect on just briefly, since Parmenides mentions, and since of measures, also of parts. If it is since of measures, also of parts, I have to think that as we think about the relations among things, among particular identities, we also have to think about the relationship of the parts to the overall identity in question. And the measures apply just as much as they do between things as they do within things. So our determinate features still have a home within just as much as they do without. But one thing to keep in mind is, depending on where we are reflecting, if we are purely in determinate sphere, we're sort of in primordial landscape, primordial identity landscape. If we are already sort of within an identity and thinking about it, considering it, perhaps it's more defined and descriptive. These more descript parts can be boiled down to their fundamental determinate features. Now Aristotle responds to this. He says, doubtless, and Parmenides continues, so since it is of equal and more and fewer measures, it would also be fewer and more than itself and the others in number, and correspondingly equal to itself and the others. And to this Aristotle responds, how so? It would surely be of more measures than those it is greater than, and of as many parts as measures. And likewise, it would be of fewer measures and parts than those things it is less than, and correspondingly for those things it is equal to. So let's think about the largeness of the one that we're considering here. Largeness in this sense is the one's expression over something, an expression of the one that is smaller. Now we have to be careful with the language, because if we are saying that this thing in particular, so it's an identity of distinction. It is an identity of distinction, in the sense that it is in the center of our attention, it is of our primary focus. Now, this thing that we are identifying, it can exist anywhere along the spectrum of complexity or simplicity. When we say that it would be of greater measures, of more measures, than those things it is greater than, again, we are saying that our recognition, our determination of that thing that has some standard around it, that has some border, boundary, center, periphery, whatever, the intelligibility of that thing has greater data points or greater reference points by which we can call it a thing in the intelligible sense. Now the converse then would obviously be true. Because if we have something that is smaller, we necessarily have a smaller number of those determinations by which we have a set standard for that thing. Since it is, says Parmenides, then greater and less than and equal to itself, would it not be of measures more and fewer than and equal to itself? And since of measures, also of parts, doubtless. So since it is of parts equal to itself, it would be equal to itself in multitude. But since it is of more and fewer parts, it would be more and fewer than itself in number. Apparently, says Aristotle. So here, I think this is an important identity distinction, because it's quite easy to get lost in this sort of reducibility of the one, where we find it everywhere. And that's, in fact, the primary contention within the sophist, that if we find it everywhere, then how can there be difference? How can there be distinction between things? And keeping the subtle structure alive, I think, is the important project here as we go through this exercise. And so as the one becomes more of this pervasive thing that's identified among all things, and having these parts now made equal, and having the greater and the lesser and the larger, all sort of be equal now in this sphere of the one, because it is found everywhere. Maintaining that distinction of features that overlie this field of the expression of the one, the expression of oneness in being, is the only way I think through it. So again, since it is of parts equal to itself, it would be equal to itself in multitude. But since it is more and fewer parts, it would be more and fewer than itself in number. And here, there's an obvious difference between the identity of the one, which has these two principles and the bridge of coherence, and the information that is given, that is sort of gracefully given to those identities that are planted within the soil of the one. It's like the life-giving force of that expression is now undeniably cohering things together. And so while we say this, we're being drawn into this expansive characterization of otherness as it participates in the one. But always keeping the identity separate will let us understand that difference will not be destroyed and the maintenance of independent identities can still exist. Now, won't the one be related in the same way also to the others? Because it appears larger than they. It must also be more than they are in number. And because it appears smaller, fewer, and because it appears equal in largeness, it must also be equal to the others in multitude, necessarily. Thus in turn, as it seems, the one will be equal to, and more and fewer than itself and the others in number. Now it's kind of an interesting road to go down, because on one hand, we are not necessarily explicitly understanding, or maybe not understanding, but recognizing the fact that for oneness to be larger or fewer or equal to itself, whatever, or the one, I should say, it has to participate in this otherness. It has to participate in difference. So it cannot be a separate thing. Otherwise, it would be sort of the mirror of sameness. It would be the absolute equal, reflecting itself back at itself. Now Parmenides says, does the one also partake of time? Now it's an interesting question. Earlier on in this dialogue, we had this notion of the potential one that was pre-difference, that it was a pure unity. And we had a hard time making sense of how a pure unity can become differentiated. And in the state of purity, it didn't have determinate features. But somehow it still was. And because it didn't have these determinate features, it had no measure. Because it had no measure, it had no time. If time is to be a dimension, and that dimensionality is a sort of a form of measure, then that did not exist in that previous structure. But we progressed from that and we said, the one is subject to difference, it has parts. And so it must be subject to measure. At least this was my, measure and by extension time. And this was my conclusion from that. But what does it mean? Can time be thought of as a determinate feature? For what is time? In our case, time is something of a progression. It is something that moves forward. If we say moving backward in time, it's a reflection on things that have been, but may no longer be. It reflects a state of being. A state of being that matters to us. But if we remove our own mortality from the picture and we just look at the the implications of time. We ask ourselves, if something has been, we know that the potential has sort of been instantiated. That information has come together in a particular way to produce this outcome. It's a possibility that has been satisfied. But what of it? Well, we said before, by the interrelations among things, especially broad light cones, we have information that is shared among identities. We have information that is surely influenced by relations. And even if one identity ceases to maintain that stability for which we would say that it is the identity, as it makes the transition, there will be familiar items, familiar features. Now, the familiarity, I think, is something that is not quite ever lost, unless all being was completely destroyed somehow. And since that is unlikely, because, as we talked about, absence doesn't make any sense unless being exists. I have to imagine that also there is this particular way in which being, as it creates this image of what it is at these multiple levels, multiple layers, is never something that ceases. But also potentially never something that maintains itself in the type of stable identity formation that I'm not sure what to say here, maybe that I would hope. Meaning, and this is something still to be explored, but meaning that stable structure of myself, that as it moves into the period of instability, for which my mind and body begin to decay, and I move into death, and as the light cone begins to fade, but the light itself doesn't fade. There's this sort of transfer of information to other places to participate with different unities in different ways. Now, I think there's much more to be said here, especially in a Christian context, but this is something to be explored for a later date. Moving back to time, the question remains, does the one also partake of time? And I would have to think that the question ought to be reframed in the opposite way. That time partakes of the one. Because time itself is an identity. It is something that I wonder if we can call it a determinate feature. I think we can. Well, we say that something is before or something is after, and this can be a determinate feature. Or earlier and later. This is a determinate feature. But if this is a determinate feature, when we say earlier and later, or when we say center and periphery, although this is not time, I think there is something fundamental about the implication. Now, the implication must trace itself back to something else. And ultimately, we're tracing ourselves back to the expression of oneness and being. If we use the determinate features that imply time, like before, or later, or sooner, before and after. I don't know if before and after is exactly the words I want to use here. Later or earlier, I think, is better. It seems like there's this mid-level determinate feature. And much like we discussed about these sort of comparative terms, the structural terms, we have terms that I think offer structure to the change in identity. Because what usefulness can we say of earlier and later if it's not to view and to reflect on the specific points at which an identity is composed, and then how it may change to the next. And so much like the center and periphery gives us this structural image of an identity, time gives us a structural image of the layering of the identity as it moves, as it progresses, whatever language we want to use there. And the last reflection here, before we continue with this paragraph, is then, if this is the case, what of the relationship of these structures to the one? Well, it would seem that the features, the determinations themselves, participate in oneness, because the structure is something that can be identified, and it is something, so it must be an expression of the one. And so time is a consequence of that expression. Parmenides continues, he says, "And in partaking of time, is it and does it come to be both younger and older than, and neither younger nor older than itself and the others?" Now the answer would have to be yes in this situation, because to ask that question of the one is to ask sort of this post-expressive condition on how that condition structures the thing that gave rise to it itself. And so just as much as we see this sort of potential lens or frame shift because of our subjective experience, and potentially the limitations there, but also the unique affordance there, I think we see it also from the perspective of determinate features organizing the concept of the one. Another thing that might be interesting to consider is when we think about time and we think about the layers of reality and identity progression, I have to think that this determinate feature goes hand in hand with the influence of difference. Because as difference permeates this landscape, we have not only the possibility of the articulating identities at different points in this layered structure, but also as the identity itself begins to transform and be altered, we see the influence of difference, separating even fundamental aspects. So to reiterate in this paragraph, does the one also partake of time? And in partaking of time, is it and does it come to be both younger and older than, and neither younger nor older than itself and the others? How so? If in fact one is, being surely belongs to it. Now this is interesting. This is the first time in a while that Parmenides has brought up one of the fundamental principles of the one. We seem to have established it early on, and then that's it. We don't talk about it anymore. And we have this sort of assumed understanding of the one for pages and pages. He says, but is to be simply partaking of being with time present, just as was in communion with being together with time past, and in turn will be, is communion with being together with time future. Yes, it is, says Aristotle. So the one partakes of time, if in fact it partakes of being. Certainly, says Aristotle. So this is quite interesting. I think we should spend some time here. So today happens to be a new day. And it's a Saturday evening. It is the second day of spring. And it was in the 70s today, which is nice to have in late March. And I just wanted to take a second and say that there aren't, in my experience, there are not enough moments for which I set the proper environment just to sit in and enjoy the environment. I have a certain amount of environmental production that is extant, but it's nothing like a good Saturday night on a nice sunny day or after a nice sunny day to sit and think how things are all right and that they could be much worse. So I'm reminded from yesterday when we read the section, if in fact one is, being surely belongs to it, that we haven't spoke of the fundamental building blocks of the one for a long time, and that it's nice to get back to it. On one hand, I'd like to explore in greater detail this image of how time intersects or interacts with everything that we've been talking about. I think the explanation the other day about how in my mind I have this doesn't necessarily have to be seen in a linear manner, but there are linear elements to it in the sense that we have sort of an identifier that is at the side of our almost like a book spine. It's at the side of our layered cake that we are baking. That is the layering upon layering of informational identities. I was going to say agents, but informational identities. And when it is intersected by time, we have a place, in the human context at least, an interesting place to observe a point of being, a particular expression of oneness in being, how the underlying mechanics might orient these identities from more of the determinate to the descriptive, and then to the current presenting face. And to start with, or to follow up with, that if one is, being surely belongs to it. It just seems so reasonable that when we think about these fundamental things, in some sense beyond, but participating with the expression of oneness in being, it gives us a little bit more detail and structure behind this conceptual formation of identities, the observation of identities. Much of them are hypothetical because we're doing this sort of intellectual exercise, but it can be applied to anything that is. It can be applied to the idea of things that will be, because certainly we can bring things about in this sphere, in this domain. But is to be simply partaking of being with time present, just as was is communion with being together with time past. So I want to start just with the beginning part of that. But is to be simply partaking of being with time present. And this is a subject that was covered before. It seems like an obvious reflection to have when one is considering the temporality of identity in this sphere. Our image so far, I think, is quite primitive, though it is developing. It's not a very sophisticated one yet. And the reason that I say that is because I have this loose understanding of our various determinate features. We've gone through some exercises by which we can identify appropriate analogies in our everyday lives. I've used the apartment example, the inner living environment space. We've gone through various exercises relating to the center and the periphery, and of margins, of difference, of instantiation, of the particulars and the properties that manifest things as they currently are. And all along this sort of formal domain to building to more complex and collaborative identities, we have this whole magic of being unfolding, not just life, but being. So the first part of that, but is to be simply partaking of being with time present. Well, I think I have to ask myself, what does this do to the relationship between being and time, if this were true? So again, but is to be simply partaking of being with time present. I would have to say in that case then that the relationship of being to time or time to being is one where time is arbiter, or in control, I should say, and being is subject. And I don't think that this is the logical sequence by which we would expect this ordered system to run. Time is a thing of being, and so it must be built on that foundation. And because it is built on that foundation, it's not something that is in competition with it. It's not something that is superior to, but something that lives with, in harmony, the thing that afforded its being. Now, I speak nothing of agency here. I only speak of the raw principle of time. This strong current of change, potential, combinations of differing patterns, and moving towards multiplicity and towards moving towards unity. That time throughout all of this is setting its own environment by which other relational factors play their hand. And so as time rolls off the frailty of boundary and of the insincerity of the center, we have an experience of change, difference that is still allowing, or still providing us information, intelligible information about, perhaps that's redundant, but about the ways in which this identity is changing. Monitoring it, I suppose. I think allowing or facilitating is another good way to think about it, because now we have this sort of ecosystem born on a particular substrate, and then the particular substrate that is infused and then by extension creating its own ecosystem. But here it's not really about an authority, it's about a collaboration, it would seem. Now today happens to be a new day, and so I'm going to try to take this conversation in a different direction to satisfy the daily requirement of walking our way into something and building on what we can. Now, building off of some of the ideas from the other day, I come back to this image of the expanse of time and being in general. I think it might be worthwhile to take a step back and to examine exactly where this being is at the outset. I mean, we've done it a million times, but perhaps in a different way, maybe in a different light. I like to bring back an old image, an image of the tree. In the days where we discussed the one as predetermination and pure unification, we had this concept of of something that was pre-time, of being that was pre-time. We had this image of the tree that I symbolized as this sort of white material that was fed in from the outside, and what this tree moved into was not nothingness per se, but it was potential, it was possibility. The image only went so far. We had some fun with it. We made some good headway, I think, philosophically with it, but when we changed over to the effective difference being co-inhabiting the same dimensions as the one, we discovered that the one had parts, or we hypothesized, we went through the exercise of thinking about the one that has parts, and also participating in the articulate, subject to change. But altogether we have this marriage. What I mentioned a moment ago about wanting to find or go back to a place of beginning, going back to the principle of being itself. At a certain point, I'm not sure how much there is to say. Its meaning, like with many things, are found in its relation. Oneness by itself or being by itself. It's hard to give it fair meaning other than that we understand it to be something that's fundamental and permeates much of all of that which is. So this being, our concept of being now is quite large. It includes everything, but in our exploration, I think we've had some interesting thoughts about the types of beings that there are, the scale of being, about its implications. But the reason that I wanted to go back to this place, sort of the principled beginning, let's say, after which all things occurred, I have to think that as the one partakes of the articulate order, and since it is subject to change, we see the change not necessarily in the one, which retains a sense of the purity that we initially had gone through at the beginning of the dialogue, but rather we can see the reverberations of oneness and being in things that overlap and things that are quite differentiated from other things. And it seems clear that when we think about being the one as participating in the articulate, it's obvious to see that it has a strong relationship with time. And our question, our most important question is, well, we started with this being and oneness in the beginning. What does it mean to have time move forward? What does it mean to have time take place at all? Now, earlier we went in a little bit more detail about the nature of time and thinking about it more as not a linear progression, but rather more as a field of possibility through which things that we identify do not remain static, but rather communicate, articulate, change, and transform. And it brings into the mind all sorts of questions about the stability of being in a particular orientation, so identity, some stable being over time. And it brings questions about the broadness of the term being and oneness, and how deep these patterns of relations actually go. What is the significance about imagining the fundamental principles in the beginning versus something that is later? How do we conceptualize earlier and later in this context? There are various types of experiences that come to mind. The human experience obviously is so present, it's so forward, it's so personal and intimate, it's hard not to think through that lens. And I think about perhaps identities in general. In terms of robustness, I imagine this sort of bell curve by which in the beginning you don't really, it's still its identity. If it's part of the curve, everything under the curve is the identity. On the y-axis, as the curve increases, what do we necessarily experience? On my mind, I'm equating it. It doesn't have to necessarily be this way, but just for the thought of it, I think about a measure of stability, number one, included in the value of this y-axis. Stability. The ability for it to enter into chaotic environments and remain stable, or enter into multiplicity and remain coherent. Its ability to manage its environment without having the environment and the components within the environment transform its identity that is completely foreign to what began it. And while the peak of this curve interests me because this is the height of stability, and the mechanics there of the identity are fascinating, but also the mechanics at the beginning and the end. And this is more for time, the sake of time. And I think the x-axis can be labeled as time. But time here sort of implies not necessarily the measure, though we can think about it as a measure. What we've been doing here is describing things linguistically and meaningfully. We can do so numerically, but this x-axis of time wouldn't be represented in seconds or hours or days. It's represented in the type of time for which something exists. It's the whole lifespan, let's say, of the thing. And the very thing that allows us to see something as it changes is time itself, I think. So now when we think about the tail beginning and the tail end, at the initial point, what leads up to that on the other side of this geometry. It could be any number of things. It could be a complex set of things that come together to cause this spark to be. And again, the spark in terms of time can be quite short, and it can have quite a stable and impenetrable sense of self given a short amount of time. Or something can have a quite fluid orientation, such that there is something that was given to it in the beginning that is maintained until the end, despite difference. Now we would say that this is an aspect of oneness in being, but what in particular? Because it's not being itself, it's not oneness itself. If it were, then all identity would be the same. Rather, there's a particular when it comes to the expression of oneness. Well, we can ask ourselves, what is the particular? Is it caught up in our determinate features? Well, perhaps maybe. Depends on where we wish to focus. Our determinations will give us some clarity and separation among things, but it won't give us the type of clarity that we would have maybe at the height of its stability. And maybe there's another component we can add to our y-axis, the value of our y. And it's not just stability among chaotic environments. It's the ability to maintain the overlap or just information in general as it moves through the tiers of formal development and instantiation. There's something that connects it throughout all of these levels. And that, of course, is oneness in being, but it's an orientation at each one of these levels that is maintaining its orientation despite all of the factors that might otherwise lead to a dissolution or a transformation of that thing. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. Now, I had an unfortunate circumstance happen earlier today, and that circumstance was that I had lost or forgotten where I placed part 4 of my dialogue of Parmenides, and I've been debating whether or not I should go back and figure out if I should explore that in more detail, or to redo it, or to just sort of move past it. But once we finish this dialogue, perhaps I'll have to wait and see. This has happened one other time when I went through the book of Psalms, and I ended up redoing that episode, so we'll have to see. I'll have to see what comes of this. It may be interesting to go back to an earlier episode and insert some advanced thoughts into an area that was not advanced before. Sort of a break in that continuity. But again, we'll have to see. Now, the second thing I wanted to mention before we really kick this off, and I'm going to try not to keep run this episode too much longer. I don't like it being much over 2 hours, but it's almost 2.5. Is that I made sort of a deal. Maybe not a deal, but I proposed something to God that, although on one hand, the whole point of doing this and sitting here every day, every night, going through this and trying to learn something about something, that it wouldn't just be this sort of rational, deductive reasoning. It would also have this component for which I am purposefully moving towards and improving my relationship, improving my proximity to God and to God's influence. And so with this, I want to keep this in mind. And I think from here on out, I'm going to try my best to explore the implications of God, of the divine, of love, of connectedness, of, as we're exploring how identities come to be and their relations, what of the sophistication among these relations is constant and consistent. As by this we have some quite large patterns that we can reflect on. And now as we speak of time, I think this is one of the first where some of these, there's a pull in me, and I'm not really sure if the pull is because I'm desiring it or because I think that there's something there that seems quite off about the way that I perceive time, the way that I interact with it, that perhaps deserves a little bit more thought. So when thinking about time and thinking about this image, for which it can be a bit variable depending on when I'm thinking about it, but I think about this interweaving, and I think about intelligibility. I think about how the identities are intelligible, but also shifting and changing under the influence of time. That it's not a static image, it's not a static relationship, but largely a dynamic one. And the concept of motion, which has not been brought up yet, it's almost an inherent next step after talking about time, because if change occurs, then we have to ask ourselves the question, well, what is responsible for the change? If we go from just imagining the primordial identity landscape and determinate landscape, static relations, to something that is dynamic and continually unfolding, then again I have to ask the question, what is responsible? And as much as that I am on this path to move myself closer to God, I don't want to insert God into a place where I ought not to insert God. But I think that there's a type of unification that, from a subjective or human standpoint, that one's unification with God affords certain things. It affords, I think, not necessarily luxury or greatness, and perhaps not even contentment. Contentment, I think, comes. But it's more of a realization of one's place within the grand scheme of things. And even if it's a low-resolution view, there is a confidence in that place. The confidence is almost an identity in and of itself, in that following sense. In the sense that it remains stable, the confidence on an existential level or ontological level is quite deep to the disposition of man, I think. And the better oriented this thing is, the more confident we are at our own orientation, whether it be spoken or unspoken, realized or not. It calms the seas of the anxious heart and the skeptic, rational subject that exists within all of us. It calms it not because it is moving to a passive disposition, but it calms it because there is something greater that is understood about its place in an environment that would otherwise seem chaotic, unstable, uncertain. But moving back to time, it is the image, I think, is so useful. I can't stop thinking about it, in which we have not just the linear expansion of this thing that we call time, but the environment that affords dynamism, sort of an environment that, by its relationship to it, it causes motion to be effective. It's not just something that is vibrating in the space that it holds. It's something that has various parts, and these various parts are bumping up into the boundaries and the borders of other parts. Sometimes there is this intermixing of parts, of some more superficial, some more fundamental, and there is this casting of shadows and illumination of spaces. That I have to pause and just think how difficult on one hand it is to comprehend, but on the other, how much possibility there is. It seems like there's almost endless possibilities. Now, to go back to the dialogue, Parmenides says, "But is to be simply partaking of being with time present, just as was is communion with being together with time past, and in turn will be is communion with being together with time future." Now, of course, we have this language. Not reconciling with beginning and ending of things, I think, is difficult. I'm not sure why it's difficult. The question is it difficult because of a matter of perspective? Well, perhaps it is. I'd have to imagine that if we understand all articulate things to be intelligible. However, in our case at least, the subject is not able to intuit or to realize all of the things that are intelligible. And so we can't see what is in the past or in the future. I suppose we can see what's in the past to a degree, based on what's passed down to us and what is observable in the environment, just as much as we can observe what might be in the future based on the particular set of circumstances at the present or in the past, patterns that have occurred over time and that are likely to move themselves into the future. But a strict observation of these things as we observe the here and now is not something within our capacity. What is within our capacity, though, may be a beginning and an ending of something maybe quite trivial. Let's say a chicken, the life of a chicken, the life of a pet, the life of some sort of butchered meat that we buy at the grocery store or procure from an animal and then put in our freezer and then defrost it and cook it. There's a beginning and ending to this whole cycle. There are plenty of cycles in life that we are witness to. And so here we see the beginning and the ending without the demise of the agent that is witnessing it. And I think that's important. It's important because we can see how, at least on one hand, at one level, it's possible to see the beginning and the ending of something. And by this we can, I think, appreciate, although we may not be able to see with our own eyes, the complexity of what it means for a beginning to take place and for an ending to take place. Childbirth, I think, is another good example of this, insofar as we can appreciate the beginning of it from its inception to to the birth of the child and through the raising and the maturing of the child. And it is, of course, a matter of attention by which we can appreciate such a thing. There are plenty that perhaps don't pay much attention at all. I'm not sure what types of parents these people produce, but I can't imagine that it's as rich as the type of experience where those who raise a child are very attentive. But this raises some questions about being. The central question that Parmenides raises here is being restricted to its life cycle. How do we conceptualize? Well, I think we understand, actually, how to conceptualize what is past and what is future. In our context, what is past and what is future is something that was but no longer is, and what will come to be but is not yet. Now, there's a certain respect or aspect of this by which I can say what was about myself a second ago, now 2 seconds ago, now 3 seconds ago, is different than I am now. Not by much, but there is difference. Not to the smallest detail, there is difference. And we could broaden that out into the largest difference, into a transformation of identity. In some time future, I know that I, as I sit and speak here, will no longer be no longer possess the facilities, or the faculties perhaps faculties is the word, to express myself in the way that I am now. There's a time at which my body will fade into the earth, and I will no longer be in the sense that I am now. But the reflection of comparing the two, between who I was a couple seconds ago to the point at which I will no longer be, not in the small sense, but in the large sense. There's a curiosity in that. I suppose on one hand we can chalk it up to just a basic intensity difference, let's say. Intensity difference being not the most appropriate word for this, but it meaning that in terms of identity shift, the identity change, that there can be this sort of broad spectrum where in the former example of myself a couple seconds ago, what we have is still intra-identity. And in the case where we have the ending and what is now come to be in the past, or its being is past, let's say. This is sort of the extra being sense. And without getting into these ideas and these thoughts about being persisting after the life that it presents as, or as the speaking voice of this life presents as, I know that it's a bizarre thing to know something, to know that you don't know something. And yet, the concepts in the mind are so poor to comprehend exactly what is missing that it can be frustrating. Now, to Parmenides' questions here, he says, yes, it is. And Parmenides follows up and he says, so the one partakes of time, if in fact it partakes of being. And Aristotle says, certainly. Now this is where I'm going to end this episode, and I'll continue next time with part 17.